And so okay, there, share, put on the sound. Okay. All right. Hopefully you can see the word adaptations. Could you nod? Yeah. Thank you. All right. So this is following on from the last lesson, and in the one before, it's all sort of an evolutionary process. So that last one was ecology, and you'll see a lot of overlap in these two, but different sorts of information, different sorts of detail. So any organism, including man, in the early days, had to that we have today, they have adapted. So they have evolved, and evolution comes into this. But they evolved and adapted to a specific environment that they live in, and and there will be lots of examples. So they can adapt to their specific environments, and to be able to do that, though, they have to have already built into their genes the capacity to be able to survive in these habitats. If they don't, they're dead. It's very straightforward. So where do these changes come from? Well, we have this idea of genetics, and I don't know how much you guys remember from the past, but we have within our DNA, we have a series of mutations, and we are really a whole bag of mutations. If you think that Homo sapiens have, well, the Homo group been around since about 2 million years, but before that, we split off from the chimpanzees about 6 million years ago. Not that we look much like chimpanzees now, because with all the different groups that came after that, so we are who we are. So we haven't been like us for very long in the scheme of things. So we are a bag of mutations, but there are mutations and there are mutations. First of all, they're good mutations and also bad mutations, and they're the ones that kill people off. But the good mutations depend on the environment that you're in. Now, the mutations that we're talking about, the variations, occur when the sex cells are produced. Now, women produce an egg every 28 days or so, an ovum. The sperm are being produced constantly, millions and millions a day. And in this process called meiosis, as opposed to mitosis, which I haven't gone through this year yet, but there's an exchange of information within each process, within each sperm being produced, within each egg being produced. So there's variations, and then they mix later on with the partner's cells. And these changes, if they're any good, are passed on. And now, as I said, some mutations are really useful. Some they kill the offspring off either early on or a bit later, or they have no effect at all. So when an organism, whatever it may be, wherever it may be, if the environment is nice and stable, there's no issue, the mutations might be just sitting in the background waiting for a change. If they're there's no advantage to having the mutations until the environment changes. So when there are changes, depending on what the change is, it may or may not be useful. It may be advantageous, maybe not. So within a population, those individuals with a useful mutation will have a better chance of surviving than those without. And those without just die out. And this is called, according to Darwin, he came up with the idea of survival of the fittest. So what sort of changes are there possible? We have an increase or decrease in temperature. Now, we're not talking people here, because I've got the heating on at the moment. I'm cold. I can change the temperature in this room comfortably. We talked about anything outside of humans. Increase or decrease of water and food availability. Increase or decrease of the population. So for some reason, sorry, I was just looking to see the recording was going in. It is. But so there could be an environment which is really wonderful and the population just shoots up. When as soon as the population shoots up, they use up the food, they use up the fowl, the water, all sorts of things happen. So increase or decrease in the habitat. If like now with, for example, the South Pacific Islands, they're being inundated by seawater. So they're having all sorts of problems with the creatures and the plants living there. Increase or decrease of predators. If there are more predators or fewer predators, either the population goes down or goes up. Then you've got competition. So if you're a predator and you've got other predators, the more other predators there are, the competition is increasing and you get less food. Of course, humidity affects mainly plants, not so much animals, but if the humidity decreases and the plant can't cope with that, it'll die. If the humidity increases, that's okay, they can handle that. Now, if there's floods, if there's drought, major issue. The wind, that's a plant's worst enemy. Wind, because it carries away the water, and if there's limited water and the wind is high, the plant will die. So let's have a look at some adaptations from around the world. Now, there are plants everywhere except where the permanent ice is at the poles. Some examples of adaptations in plants I'll have a look at: the rainforests in the arid areas, Arctic areas in summer, the intertidal zones, soils low in nitrogen, and large trees in sandy or shallow soils. So I'll spend a little bit of time on each one of these. So rainforests are very rich in diversity. The canopy is very high and it's dense due to the competition for light. So the plant, with very little light coming through to the lower levels. So the shorter plants, of course, have a problem with accessing light. So they are generally have large leaves, very large leaves, to capture as much of this. It's filtered light, it's not direct light. And the leaves are also dark green, much darker than what we normally see. Especially in Australian plants, it's sort of a light green-grey. There's plenty of sun. So what these lower stories, they produce a huge amount of chlorophyll. And if you have any indoor plants at home, and some of them, as you know, you've probably seen have very dark leaves, you will know that they came originally from a jungle situation. where a situation where there are very little light that comes through, like that. Now, water and temperature in rainforest is not a problem, and they have structures which allow them to survive there. And but not all plants can survive in the rainforest, like not all plants can survive in other ecological areas. So that in the tropics, because it's warm and it's wet, it's ideal for growing. The density is very, very strong, very great. And this density leads to adaptations that allow them to survive in these levels of forest. So they actually have stories, levels. And I've found a few photos to show you. If you look at, this is a jungle somewhere. When I look for photos, it usually doesn't say where the place is, but you can see that the density of the plants looking up. You get a little bit of light coming through, but direct sun is rare, and this one similar. I don't know if you know what the ginger plant looks like, but this is it here. And this grows on the ground in a dense area. Bromeliads, a lot of people have them in their gardens, and they're the ones that actually collect water. So they have a sort of a jug situation down the bottom, and when it rains, they collect water, and that invites various insects, and that helps the pollination process. Here's another photo. This is, okay, this would be somewhere in Asia, I'd say, by looking at these plants here. Now, epiphytes, they're not parasitic. They don't kill off their host, but what they do, like these ones I just showed you, like the bromeliads, they actually grow on the trunk of the tree. So the higher they can get, the more light they will get. There's plenty of water, there's no issue there. Temperature's fairly constant all the time. Orchids are known for this as well, and lots of ferns, and there are air plants as well. And they just sit there, attached to the trunks of the trees, but not affecting the trees at all. So this is really, really good. These are called epiphytes. So they survive fantastically well, and they take no space in the soil. They can grow in the soil, but there's no need for them. They work that way of getting up high. They also capture foliage in the way it's settled in, and as the foliage rots within their leaves, it provides them with the nutrients. So they get the nutrients, they get light, they get water. What more could a plant ask for? Here's some more epiphytic ferns, plants. So this is, if you can see, there's a roof there, but it's a nice idea here where there's a trunk and this fern grows on it. The couple of orchids here. There are alga. Alga is a singular of algae or algae. Epiphytic figs. I'll come back to that in a sec. And here's another fern here. What are they called? Staghorn ferns, I think. And so they're attached to the trunk, and they will just catch whatever falls into them, and it rots there. This epiphytic fig is amazing. It starts off high up, and its seeds are dropped by a bird in its poo, and starts to grow down. So it starts to grow roots following the tree. And as it grows, the roots then send out lateral roots. And after a period of time, it completely surrounds the tree. And these roots are very tough. So they're in the soil, they're around the tree, and eventually completely consumes the tree. And the tree inside rots away. And then the fig just goes ahead and lives for a long time. So now that is an amazing adaptation. In arid areas, there's what's called a chronic shortage of water. There's very little water at any time. So they develop many adaptations to allow them to survive. So, for example, they will photosynthesize at dawn and at dusk. This is around the world. At dawn and dusk, there's a little bit of light. It's not hot. They open up the stomata so they can get carbon dioxide into them. Unfortunately, every time they open the stomata, I'll show there's some little pictures later, they lose water. So they do it when there's the least chance of losing the water, but they do need the carbon dioxide. They have leaves that control water loss. I've got some examples of that. And so they're not like the normal leaves that you see. They also have leaves that track the sun to reduce the amount of heat. And Australian eucalypts in the outback are known for this. The branches that direct the rain down to the trunk. I'll give you more detail shortly. And these ones here, they have these very dense roots near the surface, near the trunk, and every drop of water is absorbed. They can store water in their trunks. They can hibernate if necessary. Okay, so here's a diagram where you have usually the stomata. By the way, the word stomata is the plural of stoma. It's an opening. So people have stomas surgically put in for them. For example, if they have to have a bag for their urine or for their feces, so they have a stoma. Okay, just that opening. They use the same word. There are layers. So we have an upper and lower epidermis. Epidermis is like us. We have our skin. There are different sorts of cells. So these ones are always called the palisade mesophyll, or parenchyma is another word for it. Now, palisade is a Greek word for column. So you have palisades in buildings, and the bottom bit is what's called the spongy mesophyll or parenchyma, and it's got lots of air spaces, and the air comes in and out through the stomata. And the stomata are open in the morning and close at night under normal conditions, and they have two cells there called guard cells. They also plants have mechanisms for moving water and food around the place. So the xylem is where the water goes, and the phloem is where the food goes, and it's a bit more complicated than what I'm making it out to be, but just for now, that's a basic structure of a leaf. Not all leaves, but most leaves. It also has what's called a cuticle, and it's waxy because you have to stop develop this to stop the loss of water through the surface. The only time it loses water is through the stomata when they're open. So here's a sort of a diagram of a cross section. So you've got your this lightish green is your cuticle, then you've got your upper epidermis, lower epidermis, the palisades, the sponges, and then you've got these spaces. This is important to know as to why the plant does what it does. So, and this is the vascular bundle. It's only a diagram. here you can see the stoma, and there's more water outside, inside than outside. Of course, it's very wet. So as soon as they open, water rushes out just because it's in vapor form. But when they're open, carbon dioxide goes in because it's been using carbon dioxide to make its food, its sugar, its glucose. But they also produce oxygen, and that's when the oxygen comes out, which isn't shown there. Now, under normal conditions, if you look out the window, you'll see leaves of all sorts of shapes. But under conditions where it's very, very dry, it doesn't have to be hot, but it has to be dry. The leaves have become rolled like that. So the whole leaf is that. And what you saw in the bottom here, bottom of the leaf, is now on the inside. And here's a real leaf, a cross section of such a leaf. So you have these little pits where the stomata are. It's waxy right around to help the loss of water. And inside it's hairy, all these hairs, so that the air gets trapped in the hair. So you don't get, I mean, this is open, but the air and the moisture in the air gets trapped. And it works really, really, really well. These are not spikes like cactus, for example. It's not like that. They're quite soft, but they're there just to control the movement of air and moist air, especially. Here's a microscope, a section for a microscopic section, where it's this bit here is the pit, and these little bits here are the stomata. There are 3 stomata here. Okay, you got them through. So instead of rolling, they actually have formed these depressions, but they've got hairs which are hard to see here. There. So again, it's all stored inside. So if it's windy or whatever, it doesn't really affect the loss of water. Now, I don't know if you're thinking about what an amazing set of adaptations we've got just here. That over the millions and millions of years, the plants have been able to survive in absolute dryness, high wind, whatever it is, wherever they found themselves. They have developed these different systems. So by having the rolled leaves, they have the sunken stomata, they have the hairy system inside. So they conserve water by having a high humidity in the leaf. And the high humidity reduces the loss of water because the diffusion of water into the air is much, much reduced. Also, the loss of water due to wind is also reduced. Now, wind is a plant's worst enemy. When it's windy, it just takes the water away. In a moderate or in a jungle type situation or a temperate situation, in Australia it's called temperate, like here where we are now, except the desert. Water is not an issue. There's always water, but in other areas where it's ice all the time or it's sand, dry. I've lost the word, but the outback is very difficult for plants. So we have arid area plants. So we have got 2 plants here. These things here, the Xanthorrhoea, they're also called black boys, but it's not politically correct these days. Now, these are people grow them around here. You see them if you look. But what they do they, first of all, for reproductive purposes, they grow these long, long stems, and along the side is the tiny flowers, and they grow to a particular height. But where they live, they have moths that fly at a particular height. The moths will stop there and get a drink of nectar and then pollinate. So they go from flower to flower and they pollinate the flowers and the plants. Also, the leaves of these, as well as the spinifex grass down here, are very hardy. They have very thick cuticles and they're very, very thin. So there's not much sponginess there at all. They're also very slow growing because there's not enough water. They're also the baobab trees. They're here in Australia and they're also in Africa. And if you have a look, that is full of water collected. It's not like a bath type water, it's within the cells, but they can tap, the water can flow out. If Aborigines used to be able to tap these, and they're the branches and leaves, minimal, absolutely minimal leaves, just enough. A tree like this will be hundreds and hundreds of years old. And if you look at the other trees around it, they're just not growing. They're green, they're alive, but it's very difficult. So they conserve plants in arid areas, very, very dry. They have thick, waxy cuticles. That's the layer, the waxy layer on the top and the bottom. They have thick, leathery leaves, of which have the waxy cuticles. They photosynthesize at dawn and dusk, so the stomata only open at dawn and dusk, then they close for the day. They have trunks which store, some have trunks which store water. There are others called xerophytes. Now, the phytes, a phyte is a plant. Xero means dry. So these are dry area plants. And if you remember, and I'm sure all of you will, back in the days when photocopying started, the plants that came out, the paper came out wet. Okay, so and then when Xerox discovered how to do dry photocopying, they called themselves Xerox from the zero dry. And so just to give you something to hang the word on. So all these guys here have modified leaves which have gone into these spikes. They are very thick. They are very wet inside, but everything's waterproof. If you look at how this, I don't know where these are from. I'd say somewhere in America, but could be in Asia. These here, you've got a bit of fruit there, which some insect will take away, and these sorts of very thick skin, very thick cuticles, all dry, and they will live for years. Even if there's no rain, they'll still live, and these grooves will get deeper as it shrinks, uses up the water that it's got. And then it's got a very, very dense, all of these got very dense, shallow roots. So any little bit of water that comes, you've got to suck it up immediately and conserve it. So succulents like cacti are happy, so the leaves are modified to thorns. You get sunken stomata, and I should go back. There are no leaves. The stomata are sunken inside along the green bits. So they have chlorophyll. I'll get to sunken stomata in a moment. And they have large surface area to volume ratios to lose heat. And I'll come back to surface area to volume ratio. trees in arid areas have branches which grow in a way that when it's raining and water is needed, it's directed directly into the soil at the trunks, where they have this dense root system. So Alocasuarinas, for example, you can see very clearly that all the branches grow, so water comes down, trickles along the gut ring, if you like, of the branches, along the base. They've got two different sorts of roots. They've got the roots which support them, which hold them in the soil, and they've got the roots which absorb water. And they're very dense, the water absorbed ones there. These labels are mine, so there wasn't anywhere else to put it. The acacia, the same. Look, you can see very clearly that they direct the water. There are eucalypts in arid areas where they have the leaf, the edge of the leaf. For example, if there's your leaf, the edge of the leaf follows the sun, so it rotates following the sun. So it shows the sun the minimum surface area possible, but it still needs the sun to photosynthesize. And this tracking the sun is called heliotropism. Helio means the sun, or the light, and the tropism is towards. Now, these edges, of course, have much smaller surface area, so it reduces the amount of heat that each leaf absorbs. After sundown, so instead during the day, they track around, and then at night, they just go back. Sunflowers are known for this. And I've got a whole series of little clips, video clips, but this is a pretty long talk, so maybe I'll skip these, and if you're interested, just pop back and you'll see it for yourself. Is that okay? Yeah. Now, there's going arid in the heat and the desert to the Arctic, and there they've got now, Arctic actually has soil, but only at certain times of the year, because it's otherwise covered in ice. But it's very, very cold. And there's a plant called a poppy, which has an amazing adaptation. And nearly all these species are perennial. They're there all the time, even when it's the water is sort of more or less frozen. But the problem is they receive so little energy because the sun is so weak. It takes so much energy to produce seeds, to germinate and everything. They just stay there the whole time. And so everything's done quickly. And but they're there. They just don't have the time. They don't have the energy. So to avoid these terrible winds and cold, they're also very, very small, very short plants. Now, poppy flower is parabolic, like a satellite dish. It's got a heat absorbing center, and it tracks the sun. And it's called, again, heliotropism. So you've got this solar collector, collects the light and the heat. So by doing this, it raises the temperature by about 10 degrees Celsius. And so especially when the seeds are forming and ripening, it's most important. because this is an adaptation for it to be able to reproduce. And the strategy further promotes reproduction, of course, by attracting insects. Now, when we say that, it's got the little bits inside and the flowering bits inside the thing, and flies, Arctic flies, fly to that, and the point where they sit is the concentration point of the light, the heat. So they warm up, but in doing that, they're actually pollinating the flowers. That is an adaptation. And these black hairs, which trap the air, and also they have that on the inside, and it keeps the plant warm to some degree. So here's the Arctic poppy. That's what it looks like. There's an insect there. You can probably see it a little bit better in these ones here from the side. It's like a dish, like a radar dish. It's only about 10 to 15 centimeters high. It's not big at all. And the idea is for these insects to come in, to warm up. They walk around. You can see a few, 1, 2, 3, 3 or 4 there. And there are the pollen sacs, you can see there. And this is the female part. And then these guys pick up the pollen from one flower and deliver it to the next. So it's an amazing situation. Now, just moving away to another, moving on rather, how do plants disperse their seeds? They produce seeds, they want to reproduce themselves elsewhere, but not next to each other, next to themselves, they're under the competition. So they need to move them away. It prevents overgrowth, reduces competition. Competition for resources like food, water, light, and then by them moving away somewhere, then they could start new colonies. And there are many, many adaptations for the seed dispersal. And here's I'll show you this one.
In emergencies, children need a champion to care for and protect them. UNICEF is there for children with life-saving help in 48 hours, 100% donor funding, always there.
So now I need to get out of that. I need to share.
In our previous video, we learned the fertilization process and what it leads to. The process helps in the formation of fruits and seeds enclosed in them. The seeds are the structures containing the embryo within. Now all that's required is proper rooting of the seeds in the soil. This will result in germination and thus growth of a new plant. But now the question arises, how are these seeds fixed in the soil? Do they always get rooted near the parent plant from where they arise? Or sometimes at distances as well? Seeds can be dispersed to nearby or distant places as well, all thanks to the process of seed dispersal. The process by which seeds are dispersed to distant places by various agents is known as dispersal of seeds. Who are these agents? Seeds are transferred to various places by factors such as the wind, water, explosion, and animals. These agents make the process of dispersal of seeds easier. Let's now discuss about this process in detail. Our first agent of dispersal is the wind. Seeds of plants like dandelions have parachute-like or hair-like structures attached that are so light in weight that they easily get carried away by the wind. Thus, even the seeds get carried to distant places. What is the next agent we have in our list? It's water. Fruits which float, such as those of the lotus and coconut palm, are carried by water. You won't believe that coconuts can travel for thousands of kilometers across seas and oceans. Hard to believe, but they do. What is the next type of dispersal? Let me name it for you. It's called the dispersal by explosion. Did I just say explosion? You heard me right. Then what exactly explodes in a plant? In some cases, fruits or pods containing seeds burst on their own. The pods dry and split open suddenly with considerable force, which throws the seed at a distance. What are the examples of such type? We have plants like broom and peas which belong to this category. Now these were all the abiotic agents. Last in the list are the biotic agents which we need to have a look at. Biotic means living organisms. So are animals also responsible for dispersal of seeds? Yes, they are. Tell me one thing. What do we do with the seeds after eating juicy fruits? We generally throw away the seeds, right? Yes, that is how seeds from a plant growing in one area reach a completely different area. Plants are even benefited with the seed dispersal by animals. To understand this, let's take the simple example of birds. Birds also relish on the juicy fruits that have seeds within. In many cases, the seeds of the plants are too tough to germinate if planted directly into the soil. Now, if such a fruit is consumed by a bird, then the seed does not get digested in the bird's body and is thrown away directly. However, the hard seed cover softens a bit due to the chemical activity of the acids present in the bird's stomach. So as the seed passes through the bird's gut, it gets soft, and when it drops on the ground and gets rooted, it becomes easy for the seed to germinate. This is how animals can help in far and wide dispersal of seeds. Can you name some seeds which belong to this category? Blackberry, cherry, apple, and so many pulpy fruits have seeds that are dispersed by animals. Now tell me, why do we need this dispersal process? I mean, what will happen if the seeds from the parent plant get planted near it? Being near the parent plant would severely affect the growth and development of both the plants. And why so? The two will start competing for sunlight and water. That is the reason why seed dispersal is extremely useful for plants.
Hi, Pauline. Nice to see you. Okay. So I found that it's a fairly basic one, but it gives you the idea. I hope you could cope with the Indian accent. So here we have a summary of what you just said. We have seeds that are moved around by wind. Now, some of these, I have no idea what they are, like a sandbird, beggar sticks. I couldn't find anything Australian, but the idea is they all have burrs. Thistle, for example, if you have a dog, for example, walking through thistle, it'll pick up little burrs. So these are the wind ones. They're very light. There's water. So the lotus, the cattailed coconut, as she said, will travel many, many, many kilometers. There's also the explosive ones, burst, violet. I have no idea what a jewel weed is. Witch hazel would just go everywhere. Now, by humans, of course, beans, wheat, cherry, we disperse them because we eat them. And they do, and they're all very small seeds, so they just drop by. Here's an Australian example. There's the mistletoe, the the plant called the mistletoe is an epiphyte. Remember, the epiphyte are the plants that grow on other plants. And there are, the Australian one usually finds eucalypts to grow on, but there are other plants as well. So the seeds germinate on the branches, the roots grow in through the bark and tap into the host water and food supply. And a normal tree, a healthy tree, will have no problem at all with a small number of them, but sometimes they get so many they just kill the tree off. And so there's a bird here called the mistletoe bird, and that actually eats the fruit of the mistletoe, goes to another plant, another tree, and it poos the seeds on, and if it's caught in the bark, it will grow. So here's an example, top left corner. You can see the normal eucalyptus leaves around, but these dense leaves here are the the mistletoe leaves. This is the mistletoe bird, and that's a seed of the mistletoe plant, which is bottom left here. You can see them. So the red ones are ripening, the other ones are still going. And here the bird is feeding its young, which is, I like this photo, it's an unusual one. Now, viviparous plants, the vivi means live bearing. So they don't drop seeds because the seed will get washed away in the intertidal zone for mangroves. The intertidal zone is the area between the top of high tide and low tide. That's between the two tides, intertidal. So what happens with mangroves, they're surrounded by seawater twice a day. So the tide goes out, they have air, tide comes in, they're underwater, they keep going on a 6-hour cycle. So they bear live young, and the germinated seeds don't drop into the mud until they have grown a particular root, and they vary according to the species, the burrowing roots. Now, the mud that they're growing, because they're underwater half a day, are anaerobic. There's no oxygen there like normal soil. So they have to have a root system where the root, you've got two parts to it. It sticks it into the mud and stops it being washed away by the tides coming in and out. And also it has other roots which stick out of the mud, which collect the oxygen. Now, these oxygen collectors are called pneumatophores. Now, pneumo, this bit, P-N-E-U-M, means air. So a pneumatic tire on a car or bicycle is a tire that has air in it. It works on air. So the leaves of the mangroves have special cells in their leaves which extract the salt from their xylem, from the water that comes up the xylem, and then which get washed away by rain. And every year I took my year 11s in a camp and took them to a mangrove area. I'm trying to remember the name of the town we stopped at the top of Western Port Bay, looking at the map, the very top, a bit to the right, to the east. And they've got a very large mangrove area with walkways where I could take the kids, I could see the pneumatophores, and I get them to, I said, pick a leaf. So they pick a leaf, and I said, now lick the bottom of the leaf. And they so to get them to realize how salty these leaves are. And so we had a few interesting faces. This is very concentrated salt. So here they are, tides in, they're growing perfectly happily. They've got roots that hold them into the soil. These are the new metaphors. By the way, if there are mangroves and there is an area for you to walk in, you think, don't, because these are very, very hard, and if you step on them, they'll go through your foot. Not nice. Now, we said they are viviparous, which means they grow live young. So here are two versions. So they're the seeds in there, or this part here, and these drop, they're heavy, so they fall in a way that they actually fall into the mud, and they go a fair depth into the mud. This is when the tide's out. Don't ask me how they know when the tide's out. And then here's another version. They go in, and these little hooks stop them being washed away. Adaptations. Amazing. Now, carnivorous plants live in soil that is depleted in nitrogen. Most plants can't do that. They just can't live in areas without nitrogen, because you need, I don't know if you've done chemistry or biology, you know that proteins have nitrogen atoms in them. Without nitrogen, you can't have proteins, so they can't grow. So there are plants which are carnivorous, where they've attracted insects or some other animal, and they digest them. So I'll show you one of these. Okay. There should be sound, I think. Let me just go back and check that there's sound. Stop the share. Yeah, it says it. So these little bubbles here are very, very sticky.
This bud will soon become a leaf.
Oh, this is the pitcher plant.
It's no ordinary leaf. It has a special, altogether more sinister purpose. This is Nepenthes, the pitcher plant. It grows in nutrient-poor soils, so has to find nitrogen and minerals in another way. The leaf, just like a flower, attracts insects with a reward. The pitcher is coloured and scented to appeal to flies looking for a meal of rotting flesh. The visitors are rewarded with a greasy substance on the underside of the pitcher's lid. But the plant wants something in return. Not pollen, but a meal. The lip of the pitcher is covered in tiny, slippery ridges. Wax lubricates the surface further. It's extremely difficult to hold on, even for a fly. Once inside, there's no escape. The leaf holds a pool of digestive liquid. This contains microscopic elastic filaments which give it the properties of quicksand. The more the insect struggles, the deeper it sinks. Enzymes begin to dissolve the victim's body while it's still alive. Some pitchers aren't content with just insects. This one eats mice. The mice come along, perhaps attracted by the sweet nectar on the lip. They fall in, they can't get a purchase to get out, they drown, and eventually the enzymes in the pitcher's fluid dissolves the body so that eventually there's nothing left but a bit of fur and bones. This pitcher is called Nepenthes lowii. It lives on the forested slopes of Borneo's mountains. And it's perhaps the most extraordinary pitcher of them all. The evidence is that it too attracts small mammals. It secretes a sort of nectar from the underside of the lid there. And that attracts little tree shrews. This engaging little animal is U3A montana, the mountain tree shrew. It feeds on fruit and any insects it can find. It also visits pitcher plants. Until recently, what happens next was a mystery. This footage seems to show that the animal has found a way of evading the slippery death trap. What is more, it's feeding on the underside of the pitcher's lid. This pitcher doesn't get its nutriment from the bodies of dead animals. It's got another way of sustaining itself. The tree shrews come to lick it, and when they do, their rear end is directly over the pitcher so that their droppings fall into it. And it's that that provides this plant with its nourishment. It's even been suggested that that nectar contains a laxative to persuade the tree shrew to do just that.
Um, um, okay. No, we've somehow it lost where we were. I'll just quickly go through them. And welcome, Robert. Okay, you gotta have a look at these. I think the Sundew one, I was looking at it and I didn't finish it, and just finished it then. So we only got the last little bit. Now the bird catching plant on the Venus flytrap there too, yeah. And the bird catching, these are carnivorous plants. The sundew, the pitcher, Venus flytrap here. The Venus flytrap has got little hairs on it, and if an insect can walk through it, but it has to touch, I think, 2 of the hairs within a certain amount of time, and then it just closes. Then it produces enzymes and it eats it, but it can only do it once. Any one pair of leaves here can only do it once. The sundew plant is what I tried to show before, but the link is there. Have a look. This is a bird catching tree. When I used to take the year 11s to the botanic gardens, right at the entrance to the area where all the tools were and the equipment, and the guys had their lunch and so on, there was this tree, and it was about between 2 and 3 meters high, and these are the fruits, but they're very sticky, and they have a link to the area. As soon as the bird gets into it, it's so sticky the bird can't get away, and just moves around, and the more it moves around, the more of these it sticks on, and they just break off and fall, and they can't fly away, can't walk, and it'll just slowly digest it. It'll rot, and the nutrients of the bird will just go into the soil, and the bird will keep going. And this is a 6.5 minute video. I highly recommend that you watch it. I wondered now.
Ruben, I did watch that video from your link in the PowerPoint, in the Word document.
Yes.
It didn't appear, though, that the tree consumed the bird. Is that right?
No, it doesn't consume the bird. The bird rots, and the nutrients go into the soil, and then the tree gets that. Interesting, a little video though, isn't it? Besides that.
Quite disturbing, really.
Yes. Yeah. Imagine if there was a people tree.
Have you seen Lord of the Rings?
Yes, yeah. Okay, now most trees have a drip line. Not all, but most. And if you've got the trees I showed you earlier, which have branches, the trees that live in arid areas have branches like upside down umbrellas almost. These ones here, like the normal trees we have in temperate areas, they have drip lines, and the water from the rain normally just goes along the top from leaf to leaf around the edge, and that right around is called the drip line. That's where you can stand under a tree when it's raining and not get wet, mostly. So this drip line is very important, and this drip line is where the edge, these are the active roots for collecting water. So if you've got a tree which you water by hand, don't do it at the trunk. There's nothing there to absorb the water. It's at the drip line. So it's a very useful thing to know with trees. So they've got the nutrients and so on all there. The rest of the roots are really supporting the roots. And then as the tree gets bigger, taller and wider, the drip line moves out. Now, buttresses are very important too, in that if you have a sandy soil, there are figs, for example, fig trees that have developed this mechanism of supporting themselves in sandy soil. And each of these is called a buttress. So to get high enough and to stop them falling over because of wood and sand is you get this amazing support. And if you've seen one of these and you just touch them, they're so hard, it's amazing. You think it's a piece of steel, it's very hard. And man has taken the idea of buttresses in their building. So with tall buildings like cathedrals, some churches or various others, they built these buttresses to support the walls. And then they eventually became these sort of things. And you can see where they hold them up. So the wall is there and you've got this other area to support it. Now, so we're talking about adaptations. So far, we've talked about plants. Let's look at animals. So there are animals that live in extreme environments and they survive. They wouldn't know any different. Camels, notamus. Now, notamus is the Australian spinifex hopping mouse. There are frogs that hibernate. There are fish with antifreeze. Then we have the surface area to volume ratio, which I mentioned earlier. I knew it was coming. So, for example, large ears for heat loss. And also the rosellas down the east coast of Australia. That comes into that. I'll show you. Before we do, I better explain surface area to volume ratio. Now, surface area to volume, first of all, surface area, if you take a cube, 1 millimeter, so if you multiply 1 by 1, it's 1 square millimeter, 1 meter square, 1 millimeter square, and you've got 6 of them, 6 surfaces. So the surface area of that is 6 square millimeters. The volume is the height by the depth by the width. In this case, 1 by 1 by 1 millimeters, so it's 1 cubic millimeter. So the surface area to volume ratio, which is what we're after, is 6 to 1. I don't know why, normally the ratio is shown with 2 dots, but they're not in this case, this is fine. So a 2 millimeter cube is surface area, the area of 1 is 2 by 2 is 4, and there are 6 sides, so it's 24 millimeters square. The volume is 2 by 2 by 2, which is 8, so it's a ratio of 3 to 1. And if you've got 4 millimeters, it comes to 1.5 to 1. So the bigger the object is, or whatever it is, the smaller the surface area to volume ratio. Okay, and the smaller it is, the larger the surface area to volume ratio. You can see that by these numbers down the bottom. Now imagine an adult and a baby. The baby is very small compared to the adult. So by definition, it has a very high surface area to volume ratio compared to the adult. So if you hear about babies locked in a car in the heat, they die because they have such a large surface area to volume ratio, they absorb the heat very quickly. Does that make sense? Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah, okay. So the surface area to volume ratio in the climate that an animal is in is very important. So the climate affects the size of the organism. So in Victoria, we have the fairy penguins, the little penguins now. And only little, but as you go further south into Antarctica, they get bigger and bigger and bigger. This is just showing penguins. I like the little drawings, but the emperor penguins, for example, the Adelies, they are very, very big penguins. And if they were too small, they would not survive. That is why the baby penguins are actually kept in a fold in the base, and it sits on the feet of the father. Usually the father. So they stay warm long enough to be able to look after themselves. So the colder the climate, the larger the animal, and that's to reduce heat loss. The hotter climate, the smaller the animal, to increase the heat loss. So someone's going to ask me, what about the elephants? Well, elephants have got this. We've got two types of elephants in the world, the Asian and the African. Now, Africa is hotter and drier than Asia. The Asian elephant is smaller than the African elephant. They both have very large ears, and their ears have a very, very large blood supply. And these ears are flat to cool them down. Adaptation, amazing. Giraffes cool because of their long necks and long legs. Hippopotamus is in the water a lot. Aha, look. Those ears are very thin, but huge in area. So the surface area to volume ratio of that ear is massive. And then, of course, they've got the trunks as well, which loses heat. Now, in Victoria, or in Australia rather, we have a whole batch of rosellas. And just looking down the east coast, we've got all these different rosellas. And look at the size of the first one, this one. Now, depending on where it lives, the area where they live, some will survive better than others. The smaller ones you'll find up north. The bigger ones, the crimson rosella is one of ours, because it's sort of temperate here. It's not too big. This one, by the way, is what's it called? I think it's called this is the orange rosella. This is the one that lives along the Murray River, because most of the body is the same color as the mud of the shore of the river. So when it's looking for seeds, it's quite well camouflaged. This one here is called the Adelaide rosella, the yellow rosella. And that's camouflaged too, because it walks around dry grass looking for seeds. So camouflage comes into it. And of course, we're talking about surface area to volume ratio. The hotter it is, the smaller they are. So it's all about heat loss and heat gain. Now, camels, they have all sorts of adaptations, amazing. So their nostrils they close it up, have a quick breath, close it up to keep the sand out. They have these great big eyelashes, huge eyelashes, which they can see through, that keeps the sand out. The hair on the back actually reflects the heat. So it tries to keep it it reduces the amount of heat it absorbs. Now the humps, you get the dromedaries and the Bactrians. Okay, this is a picture of a dromedary. It's got a single hump. The Bactrian, this is African. The Asian one has got a double. And the hump is full of fat. And that's a food store. So it can go for a long time without needing to eat or drink. Because when the fat breaks out and breaks down, it also produces water in the process, but it needs water, of course, regularly. It's got a leathery mouth because it'll eat anything. So the spikes are affected. Long legs, so to keep the body away from the heat of the sand, and also the hooves, which don't which don't get too hot. So, but they're not really hoops. They're padded in a way, but they look like hoops, and it stops them sinking into the very large, sinking into the sand. So the ideal animal for that condition. Now, Notamus is also called the Spinifex hopping mouse, and it lives it's an Australian. It's very, very active for the day, parts of the day rather, and it lives in a dry area with very little rain. So its water, comes from by eating starchy grains. Starch, when it breaks down and when it's metabolized, produces water. So it never needs to drink. It's only small, by the way. It's well, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 centimeters, very small. It can tolerate very high concentrations of urea, which we can't. So we have very dilute urea. We go to the toilet, whether you drink enough or not. If you don't drink enough water, you still have to go to the toilet to urinate, and the urea is very concentrated. So the color of your urine tells you your hydration level. And this guy will produce maybe 2 drops of urine a day. It can live very nicely with very high urea concentrations, which we can't. It would kill us if we had the level that they have. They also have large ears and a long tail for heat loss. I should have mentioned the feet as well, but they're on the sand. And it spends most of the day in a burrow. Now, when you go in the desert, you go down maybe a foot, 30 centimeters or so, it's always at around 25 degrees. So if you've been to Kubapidi, and they live underground there, perfect. We have a water-holding frog in Australia, in WA, and they can survive for months or even years when it's totally dry. How do they do it? Well, as a pond or a creek or wherever they is drying up, they fill themselves with water, they bury themselves in the mud, they then produce a mucus layer around them. And this mucus layer doesn't allow the water to evaporate. So it keeps them hydrated. And when the waters come back to the pond or the lake or whatever, the creek, and it reaches them, it wakes them up, and their first meal will be this mucus layer because it's before insects come along. So they come out, reproduce, and the other thing I found very interesting, the Aborigines, when it was very dry, they knew where to find these frogs. They would pop them out, dig them out, squeeze some of the water out of them, not all. We're going to put them back, and so the frogs survived usually, and the Aborigines were able to get some water. Very clever. Now the antifreeze in fish. So the fish and invertebrates that live in freezing water in the polar regions do not freeze. And they live perfectly well because they produce a protein that stops the body fluids freezing by lowering the body fluids freezing point. Instead of freezing, normal water freezes at 0. It starts freezing at 4, and then goes solid at 0. If you put some salt into it, it's much lower. So water around the Antarctic is very cold, but it's not frozen. Ice that's floating comes from the glaciers. So this protein is an antifreeze, which if in the old days, if you remember, we had to put antifreeze into our radiators when we had nights, which were really frozen nights, and people's radiator water used to freeze. So they've isolated the gene and the protein. This gene had been inserted into tomatoes for transportation by slowing down the ripening process, because with tomatoes, once you pick them, they start to deteriorate. They ripen, but they ripen fairly quickly. So by putting an antifreeze in, you can keep the tomato in a refrigerated truck, but they won't freeze. And they get to the supermarkets and the markets and whatnot. Now this is something I found yesterday or Saturday. There is a protein called anti-freezing protein 3, AFP3, and someone discovered it not long ago, and I thought, how can we do it to freeze eggs, for example, human eggs or human sperm, without any effect to those cells. So they found that they could improve what's called cryoprotective effects of whole ovaries of rabbits. So instead of doing just the cell, they took the whole rabbit ovary and froze it in this solution. And they were hoping that that could, instead of freezing eggs, which are fairly straightforward to freeze, the ovaries are not. And this is something new, very new. I'm sure you haven't heard of it. There's a thing called encystment, where bacteria, protists, single-celled animals, nematodes, tiny little wormy things, they grow cysts, little coverings of themselves, which protects them. And it's a hard shell, and it protected for any change on the outside. And then when conditions improve, they emerge from the cysts and carry on with their normal lives. So if there's a great big temperature change, they will encyst themselves and then just go into a form of dormancy. And when things change, like the frog, water-bearing frog, it comes out when the conditions are correct, are right. So this is not Nigleria. It's an encystment. So it's a little I think I've got some. Take it back. All right. So this is the normal one. This guy here, and normally it's got it just part of its life cycle. It forms a little guy, and it becomes that. So it's just that normal thing. If it undergoes mitosis, where it splits this way and just goes around and around. So we've got that's two ways of it reproducing. But when conditions are particularly bad, especially cold, it'll develop a cyst around itself and will stay there until the conditions are right. It's found it's a very nasty guy. When there are water, there's water where people like to swim in some areas, you will find the signs keep head out of the water or keep out of the water altogether. If water gets into people's noses and the Naegleria is there, it'll find its way into goes through the nasal mucosa. It's the lining of the mucus, mucus lining at the top of the nose. And I don't know if you know, but there's a very little, a small opening into the brain above the nose. And that's how they get there, all right? Through along the olfactory nerves. So the nerves go up and there's space there for these guys to climb through, get into the brain. They lay the trophozoites, the embryonics thing in the CSF, which is the fluid around the brain called the cerebrospinal fluid. It's around the brain and down the back of the spinal cord. And it's not good. It's very difficult to get rid of. People die from it. Here's a sign. I knew I had it somewhere. The geothermal pool, keep your head above water. They're calling it prevent amoebic meningitis. It's this. Okay, so it's called the brain-eating amoeba. It's free living. It's a protist. It's only a single-celled animal, and they're found in warm water, ponds, lakes. So if you see it, tell your grandkids to keep out. It's also found in soil near warm water discharges in industrial plants. And if they're not chlorinated, which kills them, or poorly chlorinated swimming pools, then they could be found there too. Now, animal densities in the oceans is interesting. The densities and diversities depends on the temperature of the water. Now, the temperature affects the amount of gas that water can hold. And so any gas, carbon dioxide, oxygen, whatever it might be, the warmer the water, the less the gas. Therefore, the colder the water, the more oxygen, the more carbon dioxide that the water holds. So warm water around the tropics and subtropics holds little oxygen. So they have great diversity, but not large numbers of them, because there's not enough oxygen. The sea is big, but there's not enough oxygen to support everybody in the warm waters. In cold waters, with a massive amount of oxygen, huge variety of species. There aren't great numbers of species in the Antarctic or the Arctic, just because they haven't developed. Nowhere near as many as around the temperate areas in the equatorial areas. But it can sustain, in the cold water, that can sustain incredible amount of life. So there aren't that many species, but what they've got is huge numbers. Like krill, for example, all these whales, huge whales, the blue whale, it eats tons and tons of krill every day. So the number of individuals is enormous, but limited varieties. So the world's fishing fleets are always around polar regions. So that's in the North Sea, they have massive fishing areas. But and I've said this earlier this year, when you have global warming and the ice in the Arctic region is melting, allows the water in the North Sea, instead of to drop down and then go back towards the equator, it goes over the top. And and then for the water is not so cold, and they because the water that's come up from the equator is warmish, cools down, but it's not as cold. And the fishing is terrible now. The numbers are not really good. So if you think about whales, I mentioned blue whale, they generally live in cold water. And the unlimited food there. And they travel to the warmer areas, humpback whales, especially in this area, for reproductive purposes, to give birth, and then they can't take the young one back immediately because the young one it's got a large surface area to volume ratio, it's only small. So they have to wait till it's big enough. And somehow they know, and they go back to the cooler regions and then they grow. Now, time-wise, it's nearly half, or it's 20 past. These are two are really worth watching. About mimicry, I think, is that the last one? I'll show you this one.
All right, within this pile of dead leaves in front of my hand, one of them is actually an animal. Take a close look. So, it's not those, it's not that, not that. Look at that detail. This thing is absolutely incredible. This is a katydid, and its legs look like a stick, its wings look like a leaf. It even has little holes in it as if it's a old leaf. It's got little notches taken out of it. It's got veins just like a leaf. Incredible amount of detail this thing has evolved. Now, this is called the peacock katydid. Nothing about this looks like a peacock right now, but wait until you see its defensive display. I'm gonna see if I can get it to do it. You ready? Ooh, that's it, that's it. Unreal. All right, within this pile of dead...
Okay, we've got a little bit left to do. But have a look at those other two, they're really interesting. Rock pools and intertidal zones have a problem, those animals and plants that live there, because they're covered by sea water, or uncovered, well, twice a day. So twice a day they're covered in water, like the mangroves you talked about. So they're covered in water and an uncovered board constantly. So it gets hot, gets dry. So they must be able to withstand large variations in temperature, salinity, and moisture, and whether it's in the air or underwater. Right. So they've got this issue. And I think this is the last one. This is an amazing little animal. Some of you may have seen it when we went here.
Unfortunately, this small Japanese pufferfish is dull, almost to the point of invisibility. But to compensate, he is probably nature's greatest artist. To grab a female's attention, he creates something that almost defies belief. His only tools are his fins. In his head, a plan of mathematical perfection. He ploughs the sand, breaking it up into the finest of particles. These shells aren't just rubbish to be removed. He uses them to decorate the ridges of his construction. He can't rest for more than a moment, but must work 24 hours a day for a week, or the current will destroy his creation. A final tidy up, and his masterpiece is complete. Nowhere else in nature does an animal construct something as complex and perfect as this. If this doesn't get him noticed, nothing will.
What do you think of that? Um, okay, so thus ended the lesson.
Beautiful, outstanding.
Yeah. I didn't know how to send that one. I don't think I sent that to you. So I have to have another look, but I can show it to you again anytime. I have to try and find out how I found it. But I when I do a lesson, a prepare lesson, I sort of look all over the place for interesting things. Well, I hope you you learned a little bit of maths, a little bit of physics, a little bit of biology, and I'm glad to see a couple of you turned up eventually, and that was really good.
You really deserve a long holiday and a good holiday, Ruben.
Yes, so guys,
Yeah.
in 2 weeks' time, I'll be in Adelaide for the wake, and no, so I'm just wondering if I could do the lesson from there.
No, why not? But you got to prepare.
I've got to prepare it, but anyway, I'll usually on a Sunday night beforehand or about then, I'll send an email out. I don't know what the timetable is for the wake, and if it's I don't think it'd be a Tuesday morning, but maybe it's the weekend. I might be able to do it. I'm not sure there will be. The second time someone's trying to ring me. Anyway, so study well.
Thank you. My God.
You're lucky I don't give you an exam.
Oh,
It'll keep the brain going.
mm.
I don't know what the next is, but the last few, really, if you think about it, we've looked at evolution, human evolution looked at the last time was ecology, and what I showed you today is all part of the same story of being able to fit in, to live, to survive, to reproduce in any environment. And but not all organisms were able to do that. Only the ones that developed a purely random mutations. We are a bag of mutations, but we're at the top of the thing as far as our brain can work. I mean, what other animals produced Zoom? Yeah, think about it.
Research it from, Ruben? Where do you actually find your material? How do you research it?
Well, depends what I'm doing. Well, this one, for example, I first have the topic in my head that, you know, what I want to do, and all the little subsections, and the subsections have subsections themselves. And most of it is in my head already, so I do that plan. And then as I do it, I think, well, something must be new or something I don't know, or I ask myself questions. And then I go looking.
Wow.
Then you saw what I got.
Amazing, amazing.
But as a teacher, I mean, I taught high school for 35 years, and it's in my head. But before every lesson, I knew what I was going to talk about, and I had the textbooks a year or two old. It's already out of date. So I've always been into the research, because I was in medical research before I became a teacher. I was working on blood pressure, but that's another story.
Oh, wow. And a musician as well.
And that too, yes.
Amazing.
Multitask.
Oh, hang on. I'll just stop the recording.